bunch more information about the EBSCO search credentials. We had a lot of questions about that, so we did a bunch more research and updated that, so all of that is here. And also in Chapter 15, for the Digital Repository tab of Primo VE, we've put together a page for information how to add CARLI digital collections, which my link isn't working. Well, that's terrible. Sorry about that. I'll fix that. But there is a page, I don't know where it went, for CARLI Digital Collection Repository. So how to fill that out if you want your digital collections to be searchable via Primo VE. So I will fix that link after this open conference call. So I just wanted to point that out, that we've got the updates here. So anytime we change the guide, we'll add it here. So, and as well as letting you know via email. I just haven't sent that email out. But otherwise, I just want to, you know, like we did we had a kind of impromptu open call yesterday, Ben, and we had a lot of questions that hopefully we answered well. It was a lively conversation. So hopefully folks will start asking questions today.
And I do see one just quick question. If you could grab the URL here, Jen, folks are asking for the link.
Oh, yes.
Maybe drop that in the chat.
Yeah, I'll drop that in the chat.
And yes, so it's good. We've got you know, the full hour for questions essentially, and I'm seeing one already. So I expect this will be, you know, a lively conversation, but it'll be good. So Lori Sauer from one of the CARLI members asked, does anyone know if the EBSCO credentials are available on the EBSCO admin site, or do I need to make a request to EBSCO for that? And that's one that I'm actually not familiar with that process, so I might defer to the CARLI folks there. Oh, actually, Yana is saying they are available on the EBSCO admin site, so that is probably your best bet. That's there.
Hi, this is
Denise. Go ahead, Denise.
Yeah, I can hear you, Denise.
Yeah, if you log into your EBSCO host admin, your user ID that you use to log in there is part of the API login as well. And if you don't know if you have an API or not, then yes, ask EBSCO host about that. And in a pinch, if you're not sure about how to log in to the EBSCO host admin site, you can also ask EBSCO host support about that. They usually respond pretty quickly.
All right, and I'm going to refresh this page really quick because this page link has been magically fixed, and here is the repository tab information for if you're interested in including the CARLI digital collections in your Primo VE digital repository tab. Ted wants me to zoom in. Let's see. There we go. So here's the information that is on there. So just so you know, that's the link for that. Okay.
We've got another question that says, we're a single campus, single building library, and initially when they completed the Circ Desk tab, they filled in multiple desks for the building since they have an ILL workspace which needs its own permissions and access. And they're just wondering if they need multiple or if one would work for simplicity. So for example, do they need a separate reserves desk, a separate main Circ Desk, and a separate ILL Circ Desk? So from what I understand with that, if you need to limit the circulation of locations to a specific desk, so for example, if you only want the reserves materials to be checked out from the reserves desk due to setting up staff permissions, so that say these staff can only perform functions at the reserves desk, so they should be able to be limited there. If you need to set those limits, then you can have multiple desks. If you do want to go simple and say and circulate everything through one desk, that is okay as well. So you'll have to think about at your institution what kind of limits do you need to provide to both staff access to a desk, but also the locations and the materials then shelved in those locations that circulate through desks. The next question, if we validated our form today, should we send changes we note to support? If we uploaded our validated form today, should we send changes that we note to support? What do my colleagues think with that one? I think we are waiting to hear an email from the library to say that they've finished their completed form.
She did email. We just got the email from
Okay.
Southern Illinois School of Medicine. So if you have changes and if you've submitted the form officially that way, I think, yes, you should just send an email to support to say, oh, wait. If it's a big change and you want to like retract your form, that's also fine. But for now, yes, if you have a change you want to make, just let us know on support, especially since it's before the deadline.
The next question is, we have locations that were set up by a previous director that were called happening locations. Items don't live there, but the locations are used for processing. Is this a thing that other people have, and what should we do with them? I'll start an answer, and then if my colleagues have anything to say. So with a lot of those happening locations, since they do not contain shelving materials, they're not actually needed in Alma. And so during the migration form, a lot of libraries condense those down into an obsolete location, so they'll be able to be deleted later. So if you have some of these locations that you will not need in Alma, you'll be able to delete those later in Alma. So for now, leave them in Voyager since they're still being used in Voyager, and then once we're over in Alma for the production load, we'll be able to delete them. There may be some mapping options that we can look at later for the production load, but for now, we can clean those up later. Does anyone have anything else to add to that?
Oh, that makes perfectly good sense, Debbie.
Okay. We've got the links here in the chat for where to go in EBSCO, and we can mention those later when we post the video. In the next question, in the Alma Configuration Form on the Policies, TOU, and Rules tab, for our non-circulating location, I have filled in the non-circulatable column with a no for all patron types. Do I need to bother filling out any of the other columns for these rows? If you do not fill out the other columns, the institutional defaults will be brought in when appropriate. So since they're non-circulatable, I think it would be okay to just fill out that no column, and the rest will be brought in. The next question, I accidentally deleted parts of the spreadsheet. Please advise. We'd recommend downloading a fresh copy from Box. And so if the Box does a good job of versioning, but if you have not yet re-uploaded to Box, that original copy should be there. And it would be best if you started filling it out again. That way we don't have to worry about any of the things that happen since the form is kind of fragile. On the topic of circ desks, if a library has multiple entrances but the circulation desks at each entrance do the same things, do we need multiple desks or do we use just a primary circ desk? Ben, if you could help me on this one, my thought with that is that if they wanted to keep different circ stats about how often the desks were used, like if knowing that the transactions are happening at separate physical locations, then they might want multiple desks since they do have separate physical desks. But otherwise, for policies, it's fine to just use one. So they could have multiple if they want to get counts on how many patrons are selecting each physical desk. But as far as policies go, they could also just have one.
Yeah, in addition to, patrons selecting a desk, in-house use can also be interesting if you're, collecting items from the tables or things like that and checking them in at the nearest circulation desk. But kind of the main rule of thumb that we've sort of used would be to consider if you want these items to be in transit as they go between these circulation desks. So if you have to go, up or down an elevator, if you're going to have hold shelves at in different locations, then it usually makes sense to have separate desks there. But if you can kind of trust that once an item's checked in at any of these desks, it will be reshelved, and there's no need to have it in transit between those work areas, then one desk is totally fine. And that's kind of the model that some of the CARLI staff saw at Northwestern early this spring.
Thank you, Ben. Let's see here. On the Libraries tab, opening hours, listed regular hours in 2A, but what do we do with our summer hours of 7:30 to 4:30 and the 6 weeks of closed Fridays? Should we list those in 2B? We've already listed 6 weeks of closed Fridays during the summer. So I guess the question that we can ask Ben here is, do you find it more common in Alma that when a library's hours change for the summer, so they get shorter, the standard operating hours, do libraries tend to put in exception dates for those changes, or do they tend to adjust the standard operating hours in Alma? Or is either one fine, depending?
Either is fine, but what I generally see more often is hours exceptions for that 6 weeks period, or 2 months sometimes for summer hours. I've seen a lot of institutions where you can have those shortened hours that listed as an exception, and then use the standard calendar as the sort of default. So either approach does work. It's just calendar updates usually need to be applied, and it can just create a little bit more ambiguity updating the standard hours than it does having the exception. So that's having the exception for the shortened days is typical. And then you just I believe it's a closed exception for those hours that would be, after 4:30 in this case.
Thank you, Ben. On the General tab for auto-renew loan days, the CARLI required value is 7. However, we have some items that only circulate for 7 days. Is there anywhere that we are able to set a courtesy reminder for those based on location or item type? So for things that to summarize, for things that have a loan period shorter than 7 days, can a reminder be sent out sooner? I'm going to take a look at the guide for that one. Jen, do you want to take over reading the next questions while I look that one up real quick? Just to see our recommendation
sure.
for it. Thank you.
On the Users tab, if we have a code for interlibrary loan, can we leave the patron type blank? So if there's any, you can leave patron types blank for any any users that you're not going to be expecting, any user type you're not expecting to have any patrons in Alma, or that you're not going to be using in Alma. So if you're not using that IL interlibrary loan, you can definitely not map it to a patron type if you don't want to. But that means that they won't be assigned to a TOU. So if there are patrons that are assigned to that interlibrary loan patron group, unbeknownst to you, they wouldn't be able to borrow anything. Is that correct, Ben?
Yeah, that makes sense to me, Jen.
I know there's a lot of kind of iShare created or dictated patron types, and that's where these come from. So
looking back at the question about the courtesy notices, Ben, do you know, is there somewhere where you can set it for a specific item type? This is for when the courtesy notices are sent. Can it be customized, or is it overall for the institution?
I think there are some institution level settings for that, but the profiles where I remember you attended that presentation in Atlanta, Debbie. I'm not certain that we could use that for this purpose, but you might be able to set negative values in that so that it would trigger before the loan was sent. But I'm not 100% on that. So I'd want to look into having custom reminders based on a particular item type or location. But I know those profiles can look into that, so that's something we can test beforehand. But we don't necessarily. I wouldn't consider that something essential to get in these configuration forms. But if they do just want to note that this is something they'd like to test, we can certainly do that with the test load, because there is a lot of control over that in Alma configuration, but it's not something that I think is easily achieved in the form, and it would be much better to just test it in Alma for something like that, I think.
Thank you. So we'll put that as a hold this space, and we can come back to that one.
Yeah.
We use temporary locations for display, mending, etc. If we put them in our non-circulating location type, but they make their way out to the circ desk, will the permanent location type rule kick in? So let me, I'm not certain by the permanent type rule. So they would circulate based under the location type where the item is currently functioning under. So if they had a temporary location applied, they would then circulate under the permissions of the temporary location. If that doesn't answer your question, please feel free to comment and we'll come back to it. How far in the future do we want to add our open hour exceptions? We were just thinking, as far as you want to add them now, go for it, because this means that Ex Libris staff will add them for you during migration and you won't need to do it later, but you'll also have the test period to practice adding more exceptions and adjusting the calendars as they are in there. So you can save yourself some time by putting in as many as you want into the configuration form, and then you'll also have good examples to review. But yeah, so Ted mentioned yesterday, I think, that you can also put in some exceptions that you know aren't really exceptions, since this is a test period. So you can see how those exceptions work. Like if you just pick a random week in November when you say you're closed, even if you're really not, it's the test period. So you can just see how due dates are calculated using those exceptions that you've entered. Let's see. I just lost my place in the chat if someone's got the next question ready.
I have it highlighted on my screen, actually, so I'll go ahead, Debbie. In the Alma configuration form on the Policies, TOUs, and Rules tab for the column Requestable, is this different from the setting on the Fulfillment tab on Shelf Request Policy? We want to be able to place hold requests on items that are checked out or otherwise unavailable, but not place hold on requests that are available and on the shelf. So thank you for pulling that up, whoever's driving right now. Yeah. But the fulfillment unit on hold request policy is different than the actual terms of use one. I know this is an area you've been working a little bit, Debbie. Do you want to speak to that some, or I can give a high-level explanation?
Yeah, well, thank you, Ben. It seems like the requestable column, which is in, let me get to the right part of the guide. Sorry, I'm flipping with my paper guide. Let me get to the PDF instead. But the requestable column also works with another column here on the Policies Terms of Use, which allows you to say, should it use the one from that Fulfillment tab, or should it be the one that you set here? Let's see which column that is. I'm one of the people who printed this. It's easier for me when I'm looking at it sometimes. Let's see here. So it is 3. So it's the on-shelf request policy column. That allows you to determine whether it should use, you can set a different one here, so one that is different from what you set for the location type, or whether it should use the one that is defined in that location type. So it gives you a little bit of granularity to say, like, which one of those sets of rules should be used. Do you have anything to say about that then also, Ben? Like,
Yeah, an example for this one is helpful because it can be abstract. So if we assumed that the fulfillment unit said, let's say, allow for pickup anywhere regardless of availability, that would mean that they could request the items if they were on the shelf or on loan or any other kind of status. But if the particular item type had something like large print or oversized, some kind of item policy associated with it, you could update that here to make it not requestable based on those kind of exceptions. So that might be the kind of scenario that you'd want them to be different. But this is also something that will be asking you all to test and putting in these kinds of item type level exceptions. So we really don't want you to feel pressured to imagine every single scenario. I really think it's good to just consider what's going to happen 90% of the time, and fill out the form based on that, and then we can be sure we're getting a comprehensive list during the test load period. Does that make sense to you, Debbie? Anything you want to add based off that?
I think that sounds good to me. We'll have a lot of testing to do.
Yeah.
We'll get it set to work as best as we can for us. So follow-up from our question yesterday regarding connecting Cloud Library to Alma. We spoke to Biblioteca support, and they said there's something called Stunnel that supports connection to and from Alma. How do we go about configuring this? Should we work with CARLI or directly with Alma once we have the test environment?
I can speak to that a little bit. I think I've only talked to Gordon from CARLI about Stunnel so far in the context of self-check machines. But you will want to wait until you get the test load environment to do any kind of integration with Stunnel. You will probably need to download a certificate from Alma, which will be used to authenticate your Stunnel connection, and that's just simply isn't something we can generate until you get your environment. So Stunnel can be downloaded from their website, and if you search the Alma Developers Network, we do have several guides to how Stunnel works with self-check machines, RFID machines. If you're using like a sorting robot to help your shelver staff, there is lot of information about how Alma works there. And yeah, if you go to the top left, top row, there's a search magnifying glass in the gray area, in the middle of the gray.
Yeah. Ben, just to fill you in too, this is Ted speaking. That yesterday the question came up specifically about Cloud Library being a source of ebooks, and it currently uses SIP2 as a form of authentication to verify that a patron is valid in the Voyager database. We described that the recommendation is to not use SIP2 for authenticating patrons into the other external resources.
Yeah, I do know there have been some kind of kludges or workarounds that have happened with PC reservation and a few other tools. So it is possible, but difficult to do something like that. So we can look into other solutions there. But yeah, I guess the main take homes are anything with Stunnel, we sort of have to wait until your environments are available. And thank you for finding this page here. This one's specific to self-check, but it does give you a link there to download the current version of Stunnel and get started there. So yeah, that I think this is just something that needs to wait till after the config forms are done.
The next question in the TOU tab, column 16, maximum fine per single item. How do we set the value is none? Do you put in $0? Does $0 mean that we don't fine, or is it equal to an unlimited amount for overdue items? So that maximum fine column works with what the overdue fine amount is. And so the guide mentions that if you don't want to have a limit for how much overdue fines a patron would be charged, you would leave that as none. But then your overdue fine amount column and the overdue fine period is where you're actually determining how much fines or how those overdue fines accrue. So if you don't want a patron to have overdue fines, you'd use the overdue fine amount column and the overdue fine period column to say, hey, don't charge any fines here. So you'd set overdue fine period to none. And then I've got a question out to Ex Libris to double check whether then overdue fine amount, if the period is set to none, whether the amount should be left blank or set to 0. So they'll be getting back to us on that, and then we'll be able to double check for libraries who filled out overdue fine period as none, just to make sure we've got the right either blank or 0 in the overdue fine amount. So if you're not charging fines, then the maximum fine won't come into effect. Yeah, Ben, please.
I was just going to confirm. We saw your list. There was a dozen or 2 dozen questions about zeros versus none.
Made a big list.
We'll verify all that by tomorrow. We should have that. We just got it not too long before the meeting, so we didn't get a chance to look at it closely. But also, if you have your daily fines also set to 0, we shouldn't expect this to occur either. And it's always possible to waive a fine in Alma if you're configured to allow that. So can certainly accommodate lots of approaches there. That's a more and more of a popular choice to not use fines.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. And if we find out from Ex Libris from that question that I just submitted that if a library has picked none for one of those values, that the corresponding field should be 0 or blank, the CARLI staff should be able to make those adjustments. If a library's form doesn't reflect whether it should be 0 or blank, we should be able to make those adjustments. The next question.
I'm sorry, Debbie. This is Martin from CSU.
Oh, hi, Martin.
I asked that question, and I'm confused because the guide says to put a none, but there's the field in the form says to put 0, 0.
Let's see.
Column 16 is one I was talking about. If you look at the comment above it.
Get that open. So column 16.
So when you hover, it says, please enter. Hold on.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so I guess it's just letting you know that if you're entering a dollar amount, it needs to be 00.00.
So are we able to type none in there then? Is that what we should do?
Let's see. We'll let you know once Ex Libris gets a chance to get back to us on that one.
Okay, thank you.
It'll be left none or blank or 0 will be the appropriate value for that one.
Okay.
Guess I haven't hovered enough to see all of those comments. Thank you. Next question, will there still be an interlibrary loan type for the ILLiNet libraries? If not, are there suggestions for how we, I'm butchering this one, sorry. Will there still be an interlibrary loan patron type for ILLiNet libraries? If not, are there suggestions as we already have 5 types? The ILLINET patrons are something that the CARLI office staff and Ex Libris will start working on to see how that will work during the test period. So you do not need to worry about the ILLINET patrons when working on your configuration form. The next one, on the policies, TOU, and rules, column 10, recall length, the guide says to enter none if we don't want a special loan period and that entering 0 causes it to be due immediately, but the spreadsheet requires a numeric value. So columns 10, get to the spot in the guide for that one too. This is another one where we'll be able to confirm where if someone sets none in the recall period, whether it should be blank or 0 in the recall length. So we'll be able to check that one again and get back to everybody, or make the updates in spreadsheets. We don't offer on-shelf holds. On the Fulfillment tab, we put no requesting for the on-shelf hold policy. Does this mean that the choices in the Request Pickup Configuration section at the bottom of the tab won't work for us? Let's see. So I'm reading that again in my head to make sure that I've got it. Well, Ben, are you able to think about that one faster than I am?
Yeah, so let's see. Move one, digitization, physical item, store. Yeah, so this is differentiating between patron requests and library, like your technical services or other types of work orders. So if we put no request in for the on-shelf hold policy, that doesn't mean that the choices. I don't quite understand what it means won't work for us. So consider missing when expired. There's another value in this form that kind of says things should be picked up by a certain period of time for a type of request. So yeah, oh, perfect. It's right there on the same row. So currently this one's set to 7. So if you don't pick up an item that's a move request there, that first option in row 98, after 7 days, the assumption is that Alma will make is that that item is missing and change the status on that item. So that's sort of what this row is doing. But move requests are not really associated with what your patrons would be able to do. So you'd still be able to generate a move request in Alma manually on an item, or if you wanted to move a set of records, you would still be able to do that and see it in the pick from shelf list. It's a bit different when it's a staff generated request than something that that a patron would do through Primo. So I hope that makes it more and not less clear for you, Julie.
Yeah, feel free to write a follow-up question if you'd like in the comments, or you're also all welcome to unmute yourselves as well. The next question, sorry if I missed this, but what patron type should we associate with the UB-Reg, UB-Long, UBIN, and UB-Non-Cert patron groups? Those are the 4 currently in use iShare patron groups, and for those you should, we're asking people to not associate a patron type with those. So on your Users tab, when those UB patron groups are there, and we don't have any in this demo sample form, we're getting one added, so you would just leave the patron type column blank. We're working on, since the way stubs come in at migration is different than how iShare patrons will work ongoing, we'll work to phase out those 4 old iShare patron groups, and we'll have a new one that we'll start using in Alma. So you'll leave the patron type column blank. We've got a link in the chat then to this demo, so we can post that after or with this recording as well. Next question, on the Fulfillment tab, do we need a local type? So I think that might mean location type, but we'll find out. Do we need a location type, especially for new materials? So formerly new books, which were affiliated with the book local request limit so that they could not be borrowed through iShare. Should we use a limited location type? What should we do for our reference, our periodicals? Changing this would affect the Locations tab, column D, General Location Type. So if your new materials, if they're shelved in a different location, so they're not in your main stacks, they're in a new books location, if those new books do have different permissions than the other materials in that location, you might want a new, like a separate location for those. But I also noticed you put new books / book LR. So if you could answer in the chat, when your new books are in that new books location, do they have that book LR item type always applied to them? So we'll come back to that. So yeah, so when you have your new books on the new bookshelf, do they always have a different item type? We'll come back to that one then. Can we still use temporary locations in Alma, or is it more designed to use statuses for mending, displays, and etc.? In Alma, there is still the ability to use temporary locations, but a lot can also be handled through workflows. Ben, do you want to talk more in brief about the kind of workflows that are available in Alma that we'll have the chance to test?
Yeah, one thing we are not using the configuration form for is setting up work order departments that are typically used by tech services or cataloging and acquisitions type work. So it is possible to do a lot of that kind of work in these work order departments, and in the catalog they're displayed as being on order or some process that we can either hide them from discovery entirely or make it clear that they're not kind of actively available. But some institutions do that for most of their work, and then they might still have a repair temporary location or something like that. So it is possible to have to use some temporary locations, but in most cases you would do most of your kind of mending type work, I think is the term we use there. For display, I would say that's going to be typically a temporary location. We have this Black History Month in February. We're going to put a display there. We might have some different loan policies for those items. That's a perfect use for temporary locations. Mending will typically be done with a work order, but it doesn't absolutely have to be. And as long as you kind of, test and do some practice in Alma with these workflows, either approach can kind of be handled. There's not a dictate from us on how that can be achieved.
Thank you so much, Ben. The next one is it.
Maybe I just didn't want to. Holly followed up and said that they do have those in the book LR currently.
Okay.
Their current policy is new books location and always use book LR for item type. If you want to follow up with that before we go on.
Thank you so much for letting me scroll down there in the chat for that. So since they do have a separate item type of book LR, that gives you the option to also pull in the item type exceptions with that. If you want to follow up with us after this call, we can take a look. Since you mentioned in your first question also about how periodicals and reference might be affected, it sounds like there might be multiple variables at play, seeing how you've already assigned location types and item type exceptions. So I think this would be a good one for us to follow up with directly with your library so that we can make sure that we're understanding the kind of setup that you've got. But thank you for that information, and I can send you a message after this call. The next question, is it possible to see copies of the Vanguard Library's Alma config forms to see some of the choices that they've made? We're a small library, and it might be useful to see how one of the smaller libraries are configuring Alma. Do any of my colleagues have thoughts about this?
I'll jump in and say the Vanguards, and I don't know if anybody from the Vanguards are on the call today, but they're all redoing their configuration forms for the test load process, so I'm not sure if how useful the forms would be. But Holly, I don't know if it would be worth having a conversation with someone from a Vanguard or with someone from CARLI to talk about your concerns or not. But I think that at the time of the Vanguards of the configuration, it was kind of more of a, we gave them the guide, we gave them the form, and we all learned from it. So it was enlightening in that way, but I don't know that seeing the form would be helpful to you. I mean, we took a lot of recommendations from doing it. We learned a lot from it that is benefiting everybody right now, I think.
Thank you. I lost my place in the chat again. Sorry, I clicked to the bottom and I unhighlighted what I had highlighted. Someone got the next one ready? Oh, here we go.
Yep.
Is requesting by local patrons, examples, call slip by local patrons, required to be enabled for a particular location in order to make remote storage item requesting work? Unless one of my colleagues is prepared to talk about that one, I'll ask Ben if he can. From what I've seen, it seems like yes, but if Ben, if you've got an answer to that or someone else, that'd be great.
I'm curious if this is a robotic arm or some other kind of automated retrieval service.
This would be for CSUs would be.
Yeah. That one I want to take offline. And for anything with a automated retrieval, we're going to have an integration profile. And so I imagine in most of these cases the person using the item would be going to a desk and making a request there. So this is obviously a very different scenario than requesting something for a hold shelf. So I would hold off on configuring anything for the space served by this tool, and when we start work on the integrations, we can configure what we need here. Because any kind of robotic arm or other automated retrieval system will use an integration profile and almost not communicating directly with that tool.
Okay, so if we've got questions or if they have questions, we can all be in touch about that for submitting their configuration form.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think there's a piece we're not going to be able to do the integration setup with this form. It's something that we should do at that time.
Okay, thank you. The next question, can we freeze panes in the Excel file, especially the policies, TOU, and rules tab? The answer to that is unfortunately no. The spreadsheet is really locked down and it's also fragile, as we've talked about before. So unfortunately, as you scroll, you do lose the headers. So you may want to write down what those columns represent, and that's just one of the unfortunate things. You can also shrink the zoom really small if you're able to see really well, but you'll at some point still probably scroll off and lose the headers. The next question, can you explain the options for generation routines for the barcode generation feature? Do you have examples of needed prefixes? So whoever'd like to do that one.
I know there was a little discussion about this on with CARLI last week or so, but basically the prefixes I think would be relevant are the prefixes that are used that are on CARLI's website for your institution if you are using a standard prefix there. And then in terms of almost functionality, you essentially just set a value to start at. And Alma will generate unique barcodes with a numeric value higher than that. And there's some error correction things there. If you do manually enter a barcode ahead of the value set in your configuration, there all will kind of self-correct until it finds a good one, assuming they don't run into, I think it's more than 10 of those. So it's not required to use this, and if you aren't currently using a automatic barcode generation feature with your cataloging work, I wouldn't necessarily recommend starting to use it. But you try it out either way. It's easy to configure once you get your test load as well. So I would also not prioritize this over other things in this form.
Great, thank you. The next question, where do we put our replacement costs for different item types? So the replacement cost is in the Policies, TOU, and Rules tab for the Lost Item Replacement Fee column. And so, so for each of those location types, each of the policies you've set up, you'll have that Lost Item Replacement Fee column. So you can see that there's a default set up at the top, but then you can make specific different values for those different policies. If there's an item type, it may be a reason to use an additional item type exception, even if circulation policies are the same. If an item has a different replacement cost, that's another variable that you might want to have a different row for and to set up an item type exception for. You are also able to put an item price in the item record itself, so that's an option you have as well. The next question, on the Primo VE configuration tab, the section Local Resource Types asks to define additional local resource types that may be required. What does this mean?
This is Jessica. I can jump in and take a first stab, and then Ex Libris folks, you can back me up. Those local resource types are probably not going to be applicable to very many libraries at all. It's there for if you need to define additional local resource types that are not going to be part of the standard metadata resource types. So in Primo VE, one of the facets that you're able to limit your results by is resource type. And so you're able to do to like books or government documents, conference proceedings, etc., things that you're accustomed to. So if you have cataloged other types of things that have sort of unusual or outstanding resource types, Primo VE allows you to define those here. And again, you'll be able to do them again in Alma if you've got them. And then those resource types would also be available to users to facet as well. If this doesn't sound like anything that you need, feel free to leave this section blank. Again, anything you're doing here on the configuration form, you'll be able to define again in Alma. Do you have anything else to add to that, Ben or others?
Tim, feel free to jump in if you know something I don't about that, but that's pretty much how I would explain it as well, Jessica. That's right on.
Okay, the next question, do you plan to post a recording of yesterday's session? Yep, that's already up on our recordings webpage. Let's see here. Looks like someone may navigate to that for us potentially. The next question, Ashton mentions that to view the Policies, TOU, and Rules tab, they'd use the split option on the View tab. That's not something I've ever done, but they mentioned that that's worked. The next question, with regard to the lost item replacement fee, that is not the replacement cost, it is the processing fee, correct? We usually check the current price of a lost item and charge that plus processing. So lost item replacement fee, the lost item, so in Voyager what we called the processing fine, I believe is the lost item fine in Alma. So it's the column to the left of lost item replacement fee. So lost item fine is what Voyager calls processing, and lost item replacement fee is what Voyager calls the replacement fine. The next question, on page 38, Locations tab, the default acquisition location. Since we haven't used acquisition, what should we use for this? Using technical services as the default is misleading, since this is a reference technical services collection and not the department. Do we need to add another location, or should it be the location where most titles ordered will ultimately be processed?
Hello, this is Ted. And yes, what the intention is to identify the location where most of the things you're ordering are going to end up. So it'll probably be your main stacks location. It's easy enough to change that value while you're creating a PO line. And if you choose to not create purchase order lines and just catalog things directly, then this value doesn't even get invoked, I believe.
Great, thank you. Next question, on the configuration form on the TOU tab, is there a place to indicate a maximum dollar amount that the patron or patron group, once hit, will automatically stop them from borrowing anything further? That value is actually on the Users tab. So on the Users tab, if you scroll all the way down towards the bottom, there is the patron limits option, and so that's where for patron of the 5 patron types, you can put in the max cash that the patron owes before they're blocked. So that's where you'll be entering that setting. We've reached the bottom of the questions in the chat at this point. If anyone has any others, we're also getting close to time too. We've got 5 minutes. If you've got access to your audio, you're also welcome to unmute yourself and ask a question at this time as well if you prefer. And we do have, at the CARLI office, we do have a lot of open questions still open with you all through our ticket tracking system, so we'll be getting back to you as soon as we can with those. So if you send in a ticket through support, you'll hear back from us soon. We've had another question come in. If we override and check out a non-circ item, where does the system look for the loan period? That's a good question, Ben. Do you know the answer? Like, will staff be prompted to then enter the loan period when they do an override for a non-circulating item? Or what happens at that situation?
Yeah, I know in most cases it is possible to modify the due date at the circulation desk, so you can definitely edit most loan periods. It would depend. In some cases, you could have a non-circulating item that wouldn't be overridable, and then in that case, you can discharge the item. But I don't think there is a. It may use the default loan rule in that case, but that's something I'd want to test to be sure. But I'm not 100% sure off the top of my head. But it is something that can certainly be edited when you are doing that kind of override.
That would be similar to how it functions in Voyager then at this time as well. Like if you charge something that's not circulatable, staff then select what the due date is at the time of charge. But we'll have time to practice that during the test period as well.
Absolutely. Yep. And that's one of those activities we'll probably want to put on the list to have folks try.
The next question, going back to lost items, can we charge the actual cost of the lost item instead of a fixed item replacement fee? For that, Ben, do you have any, like I know that in Alma you're able to set either the default for the policy or to have the price in the item record. Is it possible to, so I guess my question is, when a patron is charged that lost replacement fine, do staff have the chance to modify that value before a notice is sent? Or is it going to use what's in the system and then staff afterward could make the change?
Yeah, so if this charge is not defined in the terms of use, Alma can be configured to use the actual cost if that information is in the item level, record. I don't think it can be in the holding or what would have been the muff head. I think if it's something that is in the item level information, Alma can use that actual data rather than a defined value. So some institutions certainly do that, and in those cases, you wouldn't necessarily want to fill out these fields unless you wanted to do that for kind of your main area, and if things were in some locations, more expensive or kind of rare items, you could use the actual the values there. But that's something that's sort of defined in the terms of use. But if there isn't a definition in the terms of use for that, it can be pulled from the item data. When we give you your other list of questions, Debbie, sorry for those that aren't aware of this list, we can address this one specifically as well, because that's a good example.
That would be great. Yeah,
Yep.
because since you mentioned that, I'll ask also just it's already 3 o'clock on a Thursday. So we can also then double check whether in that terms of use, so some of our libraries have a few items that have an item price, but most of them don't. They've just used a default. We can double check to make sure that their settings are correct for how Alma works, that whether it's an all or none for only the default or only in the item record, we can make sure we've got that correct and get that out to people if there's a change.
Yeah, I know both. I know different libraries have done both those approaches, so I want to give accurate information about how to achieve either result.
Thank you, Ben. The next question, can you explain why policies column 5, CARLI recommends that recallable is set as no, or requires that recallable is set as no? So from what I'm understanding for how this works, and Ben, if I don't have this correct, please do correct me. But the recallable column in column 5 is saying, can another patron recall this item from another patron? But on the, let me get the other tab, on the fulfillment tab for the request recalls. So in our iShare libraries, we've had patrons are not allowed to recall an item from another patron. Library staff are allowed to recall an item for reserves or if the library needs it back for another reason, but we don't allow patrons to place recalls from other patrons. So it's going to be a little bit different in Alma in that on that fulfillment tab under request recalls, we've had you as the default set all of those recall loan types to no except move temporarily. So if how I've understood this to work will be correct, when you need to recall an item for reserves, you will instead of going in and placing the recall like you're used to doing, you will instead change the item type of that item you need to have back, even if it's checked out to a patron, to have that reserve item type as its temporary item type, and that will in itself trigger the recall. So that also means that if an item is checked out to any patron and you change its item type temporary for any reason, it will also be recalled. But from the conversations I've had with Ex Libris and at least how I've understood them, this was the most efficient way for us to be able to do recalls like we've done them in iShare. So the move temporarily setting is the one that should let you be able to recall for reserves, whereas that recallable and the policies TOU is preventing patrons from recalling from other patrons. Ben, if you've got any corrections to that, please don't hesitate to let me know.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. Alma does distinguish between move requests or other of those listed internal requests, and this is for patrons, so that's why we're requiring it so that you can just conform with iShare's policies there about patrons not recalling things from each other.
Great, thank you. And phew, I'm glad after all the talking you all have told me about recalls at Ex Libris. I'm glad it's sunk in.
Well, thank you everybody for so many great questions. I know we owe you a few responses, and we'll get them to CARLI in the next week, and I'm sure they'll update you all soon. Any other notes from CARLI at the end of the time here?
We'll be sending out some reminders of credentials that we're waiting for from some libraries, for proxy credentials and connection credentials that we've requested, and just our friendly reminder of your configuration form due date of next Wednesday. But we'll send that all to our contacts list soon. And thank you, everybody, for all your work.
And if any of the responses we get from Ex Libris change the way that we've made recommendations in the guide, we'll send out an email to the Alma contacts list to let you know that we've made those changes. And that way you know to look at that new version of the guide where we'll update it as well.
Yep.
Yeah, and hopefully Box will be back up. We agree.
Well,
I think it woke up finally. Yes, it did come back up.
Hooray.
Hooray.
Yeah, their status page said they hadn't 100% solved things, but it should be up. But of course, there could be some snafus.
Right. Your mileage may vary.
Well, good luck with that. And I wanted to say thank you again to everybody. I know everyone on this call is certainly working hard. It's a busy time. So thanks again.
Thanks, Ben.
All right. We will talk to you all next week. Have a good afternoon, everybody.
Thanks, Ben. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thanks. Goodbye.